Hello, welcome to Exotic Gardening with me, Yorkshire Kris. Whether you grow dahlias on an allotment, in a traditional cottage style garden or border, or as I do in my exotic style garden, one thing that's worth considering is how to overwinter these potentially half-hardy tender plants. Now it's November now and it's really time to start thinking about overwintering dahlias, and in this video I'm going to show you 4 different methods for overwintering this beautiful flowering plant. Here we have a wonderful single form here with red leaves, and we have got some flowers, but now we're into November, the amount of flowers we get isn't great and frost is probably around the corner. And normally what we do is we wait for the frost to blacken all the foliage before we start thinking about overwintering the dahlias, because as long as we have mild days, we like to keep the plants in the ground flowering. But like I said, now the days are a lot shorter, it's getting cooler, the chances of this producing lots more flowers is diminished compared to even just a few weeks ago in October. And although it's not frosted, by now, usually, as we get through November, we do get a decent frost that will blacken the foliage, and we have to start thinking about how we're going to overwinter it. And as I mentioned, I'm going to talk about 4 different methods, and I'm going to talk about methods that I've tried in the past. And if you remember from a long time ago, 13 years ago, I did an overwintering daily video, and this is an update on that video. So we're going to actually look at the first method, the most common method, and that is digging up dahlias. So the method we're going to talk about now is digging up the dahlias to store them inside frost-free, so there's no harm they're going to come to outside, because they're inside somewhere away from the cold and the wet. And the important thing about doing this is you want to make sure that when you dig the tubers up, you're not slicing or puncturing through the tubers. So you look at the plant, this one here, it's quite a large plant that's sprawled about in all directions, and you want to remove most of this foliage so you can see what you're working with. But you can see here all the stems are coming out of the ground in this area, so I want to get a spade far enough away to go down and under to dig up those tubers. So like I said, normally you do this when it's frosted, but this is a plant that's finished flowering, it's dying back somewhat, so I'm just going to dig it up with my spade far enough away. So there we are, we're about 10-15 centimeters away from the center. Go down, deep as you can, and lift, and you should get it up in a nice clump. And that's come away quite nicely. And you can see underneath there's the tubers, and obviously we've got lots of soil, we can take some of that off from the outside, and we've got all the tubers in there, so that is ready to be stored inside over winter. And we've got 2 options. We can pot this up, so we can literally stick this in a pot, put some compost around it, which is great, but if you've got slugs and stuff in there, they could go eating through the tubers over winter. The more traditional method is washing all this soil off, and then we store it pretty much damp over winter in sand or new compost. The idea of washing it all off is to get rid of all the creeper crawlers, the pests. You can hang it upside down. You can hang it upside down like this for a few days to let all the moisture out of the stems, and that means it's drier and it won't introduce rot. The important thing is not to cut this right back to the ground level. You want to leave a bit of stem, so a couple of inches, 5-10 centimeters of stem here. So I'm going to cut this off like this. I'll take off some of this compost and I'll show you what the tuber looks like. So now I washed off pretty much all the soil. Still a bit I need to wash off, but pretty much all of it's off, and we can see the structure of the plant. We've got the stems that we've cut back down to about 10-15 centimetres from the base, and there's a good 20-30 stems here. Lots of stems in this particular variety. But look under the stems. If I pick it up, you can see all of these wonderful round tubers, and all these tubers are connected to that base plate. Any tubers that have fallen off, you can dispose of, because they will not produce new plants, because they need to be attached to the base plate here. That's where the new growth will be next spring. These are the storage organs that stores all that energy to produce the new growth the following year. And what you want to look for, if you see any that you've cut through or damaged when you're digging them up, pull them off, and then just check they're all nice and firm. And these are nice solid ones here. And in fact, this plant used to be cultivated to grow to eat, much like potatoes are. So these tubers can be eaten. In fact, if you want to see me dig one of these up and to eat a dahlia tuber in the future, let me know if you want to see that sort of video, me cooking dahlias. And if I get, I don't know, 500 likes on this video, then I will eat some dahlias and show you the video of me doing so. But back to storing them, the next stage is to basically put it on a shelf, put it somewhere dry in a shed or in a garage, and do it upside down like this, just to let all that water drain off, because you've got water around it where you've washed it off, and also coming out of the stems as well. So dry that maybe for a week, and then after a week's passed, you want to get some sulfur powder, just dust it all over, and that prevents some fungi and some rot setting in. And then you can store it in trays of damp sand or compost. So you can use sharp sand, you can use compost, ideally new compost. Don't use old compost if it's been in the ground or in pots where you're going to have slugs and snails, things like that. Or you can use old compost that you've sieved so you haven't got those big pests, because you don't want them attacking the tubers over winter. The compost isn't there to provide nutrients for the plant, it's just to hold in a little bit of moisture around those tubers, because you don't want them to dry out too much. They can dry out a bit, but months and months of being somewhere warm and dry will mean that you won't get a strong growing plant the next year. So that is pretty much overwintering dahlias. If you want to see some other tips, I've done a digging up and an overwintering video, like I said, 13 years ago, with some other tips as well. But that is one of the main ways to store dahlias if you have very heavy soil or you grow in a cold location and you can't leave them in the ground. And then next spring, you can let the new shoots grow, take cuttings to get more plants, or you can plant the whole thing and then you'll get flowers of a big strong plant with all this energy from those tubers. So the second method I want to talk about in terms of dahlias overwintering is the easiest but also the most risky, especially if you live in a cold part of the country or an area with lots of rainfall or an area with really heavy soil. And that method is simply leaving it in the ground without doing anything to it whatsoever. All this foliage will get frosted because it is a tender plant, so it'll blacken off, and then over winter the stems will fall down to the ground and you'll get a black soggy mesh come spring. But underground, where the tubers are, provided you've got free draining soil and provided it's not too cold, so you're not getting into an area where you're getting constant ground freezes and it's sort of below -5 for days at a time at night time, then they should be fine, those tubers, because it's just the tubers, the storage organs that you're trying to protect over winter. You don't care about all the foliage or the stems, they will die off and you get new stems produced next spring when the soil warms up and you get that sunshine in on your borders. So that is the easiest method, and that is a method I predominantly use now in the garden. If you do get cold winters but you have nice free draining soil, then you can mulch them. So what you can do is you wait for the foliage to be blackened, And then you cut down the stems to about sort of 10-15 centimeters or 4 to 6 inches, so you can see where the plants are. And then you get some straw or old compost or bark chipping, something like that, and mound it around the base. Give it a few centimeters, a few inches over the base of the plant, and mark it with a label or a stone so you know where that plant is, so you don't dig through it over winter or plant over it in spring. And that will insulate the ground, it will insulate those tubers, and it means that that plant will be fine and will grow back next year. Providing, like I said, which is really critical, it's not in a heavily waterlogged area. You're not in a super heavy clay that will sit with cold water all winter, and you don't have a real bad slug issue. If you get lots of slugs that live in the ground over winter, slugs will munch on dahlia tubers, allowing rot to get in. So if you've got an area where it's full of slugs, basically, it's heavy claggy soil, it's cold and wet, and you're in a shaded area, then it won't be the best method for you. You are better using one of the other methods, which is basically lifting those tubers out of the ground, or another method which we'll talk about in a second. So a third method of overwintering dahlias is actually collecting the seed. Now this doesn't work for every type of dahlia because quite a lot of the hybrids are sterile. The big double ones are very often sterile. But the species ones, the single ones like this, very often have viable seeds. And if you store the seeds, you can grow that seed on next year, and they grow very quickly to flowering size plants in their first year, and they germinate very easily. So a really good starter, exotic style flowering plant to try from seed. And if you collect your own seed, very often, especially if you've grown lots of different dahlias, you might get a new hybrid or a new variation from the mother plant seeds. So here we have a dried seed pod, and we've talked about different types of buds and seed pods in the past. You know, if you've got the cone-shaped fleshy one like this, you know that's a flower that's already flowered. If you've got a button-shaped bud like this, that is a flower yet to come. But if you've got a cone-shaped one that's gone dry and papery, like this one, you can actually collect the seed, and all you have to do is just snap that off, and then we can actually open this up and look at the seeds inside. And these can be stored very easily in a paper bag, an envelope, keep it somewhere cool over winter, and you can sow those seeds next spring. So let's take a closer look at that seed that I just picked up from that flower. So you can see there's the bud, not the bud, the old flower that's dried off, and it just breaks apart like this. And what you get is lots and lots of seeds. You also got lots of chaff, so you get these papery bits that you don't want. But if we pick up that, you can see on the papery bit, the black bit there, that is a seed. So basically store the full lot like this in a paper bag, and you sow this in spring. And that's a really easy way to overwinter a dahlia, because you'll get new plants next spring that will look like the flowers up here or very similar, and you know you've protected them because you've got them as seeds, which you can keep them controlled in your house or your shed somewhere frost free and cool, and you know they'll store for next year and they grow big. And the good thing about storing seed is, if you're unsure whether or not you can leave your dahlias in the ground, if you've collected viable seed from a dahlia you like, then you can risk leaving out your dahlia, mulching it and seeing if it comes back next year, because then you know whether or not your ground is too heavy, or you know, if it's too cold in your area. If it survives the spring, survives the winter, grows in spring, then you know your garden is probably good enough to support leaving dahlias in the ground. Obviously, 1 year is not the rule. You might want to do it for several years in a row to see, because you get different winters. Some are warmer, some are colder, some are wetter, some are drier. But by leaving some in the ground, collecting seeds, hopefully you'll find that your garden will be good enough to keep those dahlias in the ground and come back year after year. And if not, if you lose it, you've always got that seed to fall back on, or you can choose one of the other methods to overwinter your dahlias. And the fourth, final, and probably the easiest way to overwinter dahlias is to grow them in pots. Because if you grow them in pots, you can move them indoors or somewhere frost-free as winter arrives, and that means they will get through winter with no issues at all. Now you can grow them in pots like this one here. I've cut back all the foliage because it had pretty much died off and the pot's not been watered for a while, so it's pretty much dry. And because I'm not disturbing the tubers there, the compost, like I said, is dry and will dry out because I'm going to put it somewhere indoors, then all the tubers in there will get through fine over winter. They won't be attacked by slugs because they're not in the ground. There won't be waterlogged again because they're not in the ground, and they won't freeze again because they're not in the ground. And I'm not going to leave this in the middle of the garden. I'm going to bring it into the greenhouse, put it in the dark lower shelves. If you don't have a greenhouse or heated greenhouse, you can put it into a garage, a shed, an attic, a cupboard, anywhere where it's not going to be frosty over winter. It can be dark, but it's not going to be growing. You don't want to put it somewhere warm, so above 10 degrees, because it might start the plant trying to grow over winter, and you want it to remain dormant until the end of winter into spring. So that's the fourth and easiest way. Leave it in a pot, cut back the foliage if it's been frosted off or it's the end of the season, take it indoors, forget about it until spring when you see new emerging stems from the ground. Give it a water, give it a feed. You can take cuttings at that stage, or you can leave it or repot it into another pot to give it lots of new food for the growing season ahead. So I hope you've enjoyed this video of overwintering dahlias, showing 4 different methods of how you can overwinter your dahlias depending on your location and setup and what facilities you have. Hope you found it useful, and if you've got any comments or any tips you can add to the conversation of overwintering dahlias, please comment below in the video and I'll respond to those, and other people can share that knowledge as well. If you want to know how to overwinter a wide variety of other exotic style plants, then check out my playlist on my YouTube channel. I've got overwintering videos for pretty much everything that you can easily get hold of here in the UK and Northern Europe, be it bananas, dahlias, cannas, or something a little bit more unusual. So check those videos out and join me next week while we're doing more in the garden.